Welcome everyone to today's Magical Marsh Fritillaries talk with Vaughan Matthews. Vaughan works for the INCC, the Initiative for Nature Conservation Cymru, and he's going to tell us all about Marsh Fritillary butterflies. We're going to hear from Vaughan shortly about Marsh Fritillary, but I'd just like to say that today's event is one of a series that we've been doing, and you can see all the other ones on our YouTube channel. And it's thanks to funding from the Brecon Beacons National Park and Cliff Bar, gave us some money to run a whole series of wildlife awareness events. So thanks to them, we're able to put this and the rest of our talks on. And the Biodiversity Information Service is the local environmental record centre for Powys and the Brecon Beacons National Park area of Mid Wales. You can see the map on the right there. And one of our main aims is to put wildlife on the map. So get people such as yourselves to make biological records of the wildlife that you see. And then we can do various things with that, including mapping distribution of various species. So on the right here we've got the Marsh Fritillary. You can see a picture of one there, and the red dots and squares are where we have Marsh Fritillary records in the last 10 years, so since 2011, in what we call the BIS area, so in Powys and the Brecon Beacons National Park. So you can see the odd one in North Powys, and then quite a big collection towards the south and southwest of the national park, which is where we're going to be going on the 1st of September to look at a site around there. And it's really easy to make a biological record. If you have a smartphone, there's the Lurk Wales app, which is an iRecord app, so you can use either app. Lurk Wales for records in Wales, and iRecord will also work in Wales, but also is good for the rest of the UK. If you don't have a smartphone, you can add your wildlife sightings to online sites, and iRecord is one of those. And then we have our own here in Powys and Brecon Beacons National Park called BizWired, the Biz Wildlife Recording Database. And they're all really great sites. You register, and then it has all the boxes to fill in with all the required information that is needed to make a valid biological record or wildlife record. And there's 4 pieces of information that are definitely needed, and that's the what, where, when and who. So what you've seen, what species, you don't have to give a scientific name, so Marsh Fritillary in this case is fine. Where you've seen it, so the location, usually a grid reference, and then a place name as well, so actually 2 pieces of where information. And then when, so the date, and who you are as a recorder. So the what, where, when and who, and the app and online recording sites make that really easy to put in, because they won't let you submit a record until you said the what, where, when and who. So have a look at iRecord Lurk Wales app on your smartphone. It's Android and iPhone, so both available on both phones, and also online iRecord and BizWired. And maybe we can add some more Marsh Fritillary dots to the maps in our area. You are getting involved, so that's great, welcome. But there's lots of ways that you can get involved in biological recording. Have a look at our website, bis.org.uk, for various hints and tips and getting involved information. You can also find a link to our YouTube site, where you'll be able to see this and our other events when I've uploaded them. If you want to be kept in touch with goings on in Powys and Brecon Beacons National Park, there's a sign up form on our homepage for the Biz Bulletin, which I send out about once a month. And then you can find information on our events, and also the Find an Expert section, where you can find contact details of various wildlife species groups if you have a query. So that's really useful for people that are expert in their field. You can record your wildlife sightings. Hopefully you'll start doing that if you're not doing it already, using the apps or online sites. And if you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. So have a look at our site's pages on there. And just to mention the field event that we've got happening next week, there's still a couple of places left. On Wednesday, the 1st of September, we're going to be going to a Marsh Fritillary breeding site, a field near Brinamon, and just have a look at the habitat there and management techniques for making it better for Marsh Fritillary. And we'll also see the caterpillars, which are the stage. I realised that's a dormouse. I didn't update the photo on the poster, so we might see dormouse, but I doubt it. But definitely we'll see Marsh Fritillary caterpillars. So have a look at our website, and there's a link there to the Eventbrite booking site for that. There's 3 spaces left, so if you're inspired to come along to that after today's talk, then please do book on. And just to say that this is the local environmental record centre that covers Powys and the Brecon Beacons National Park. You can see the area we covered there, and we're one of 4 local environmental record centres in Wales, covering the whole of Wales and collating all the wildlife data for Wales, and that ends up in our database called Aderin, where you can see all the wildlife in your local area. And that dots on the map, the mapping the wildlife that you see, is really useful to use it to plot distribution of species, and over time we can see population change, especially now with climate change. We've seen a lot more species moving west and north as the climate warms. So that's all from me, kind of very quickish whistle-stop tour about this and what we do. And today's main talk is with Vaughan, and we're going to hear all about the Marsh Fritillary. And I'm looking forward to this because Marsh Fritillaries are what brought me to Wales about 10 years ago, working for the then Brecknock Wildlife Trust, which is now part of the Wildlife Trust South and West Wales, on the Marsh Fritillary habitat in and around Ystrad, just at the very south of Powys. So I think they're doing well now, and I think the butterfly is doing pretty well over the last few years, and there's a lot of efforts to increase its population and distribution. So looking forward to hearing all about it from Vaughan.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invite as well, and thanks all for coming along. Yeah, my name's Vaughan. I work for the Initiative for Nature Conservation Cymru, which is quite a new charity. We go by Inc. It's rather less of a mouthful. So yeah, relatively new charity set up by Rob Parry, who was my colleague at the Wildlife Trust. So I've been working for them for 3 months, sorry, 2 days a week, as a species officer on the Marsh Fritillary project. My other 3 days, I still work for the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales as a conservation officer. So currently it's a one-year post to work on a very exciting Marsh Fritillary population reinforcement project. So my talk is basically going to cover the ecology and behaviour of fritillaries initially, and then talk a little bit about habitat management, and then go into the reintroduction / reinforcement project that is the main focus of my work at the moment. So this is Marsh Fritillary, a really beautiful little butterfly that has suffered widespread catastrophic declines across its range, and is now among the most threatened butterflies across Europe. And for that reason, it's one of the few butterflies that is afforded European protection. Its range in the UK has decreased by at least 55% since 1970. Well, that was 1970 to 2000, it decreased that much, and it's decreased more since then. So it's listed on the Wildlife and Countryside Act, so it's protected from killing, taking, this is the specific wording, protected from intentional damage or destruction to any of its places of shelter or protection. and it's also a priority species on the UK Biodiversity Action Plan, which is for those species that are most threatened and requiring conservation action. And the reason it's struggling is quite a familiar tale, basically, but loss of habitat is the main one. So a range of its marshy grassland habitat, agricultural intensification, inappropriate or lack of management on the sites where it is present, and subsequent isolation of populations. So they have a metapopulation structure, which I'll go into a little bit later. And another factor is parasitism. And again, that's a big factor and a really interesting one, which I will talk about later on and hopefully still make it interesting. So like I said, it's a beautiful butterfly, very variable. It used to be known as the dishclout or greasy fritillary, which is not a very flattering name, but that's because when it starts to lose its scales when it's a little bit older, the underwings can look quite greasy, but thankfully that didn't really catch on. So Marsh Fritillary is the better known name, thankfully. And even that is not hugely accurate, because while it tends to use marshy grassland habitat in Wales and southwest of the UK, that is far from its only habitat that it uses. The name Fritillary, in case anyone doesn't know, it was preceded by the plant being called Fritillary, and that comes from the ancient Roman fritillus, which referred to a checkered board, game board, basically, which, as you can see from the picture, it's sort of checkered. So this is what it looks like, the underwings. It's, as you can see, quite a small butterfly, weak flying. It's only 3 to 5 centimeter wingspan. The males tend to be a bit smaller than the females, which is fairly common amongst butterflies, but there is some overlap in the coloration and the size, so it's difficult to say for sure which is which. So they belong to the Nymphalidae family, which are known as brush or four-footed butterflies, and that's because the front legs, as you can see in this picture, are vestigial, so they walk about on just the 4 legs, unlike the white butterflies and the hair streaks and the blues. So as I said, they're quite variable in color. This is quite a light one, so if I go back to that one, you can see the difference, but really beautiful no matter how dark or light they are. This one is resting above dead Millennia in its marshy grassland habitat. This is an unusual aberrant form which Richard Smith photographed in Carmarthenshire, which pop up now and again. I've certainly never seen one like that. There's an Irish form which is known as Hibernica, which is generally darker and more well marked than the ones we get in the mainland. So there are some butterflies. So this is a small pearl bordered fritillary, which is about the same, confusingly, the same size, same habitat, and same flight period, but does the upper wings, as you can see, look quite different, and the underwings have the bright white markings that give them their name. And there's also the dark green fritillary, which has greener on the underwings and is bigger and much more strong flying than the Marsh Fritillary, which is frankly a little bit rubbish at flying. So whereabouts are they? In the UK, which is a relative stronghold in Europe, very relative, has to be said. The range goes across Europe as far as Korea and south to North Africa, but it's struggling throughout its range. There are scattered colonies across the range in the UK, as you can see, but they're concentrated in the southwest and in Ireland, where their damp grassland habitat is more common. So they're quite like Wales, again concentrated in the south and west of the country. This is obviously slightly outdated data now, and it's a little bit of a false impression because some of those dots equate to very few records, you know, just one or two, as Ben showed some of the records from previous to that in the BIS area. Yeah, so many of these have disappeared since 2012, unfortunately, but the area to the south of the national park, the Tonnereval area, is a real or relative hotspot for them, and one that I'll be focusing on a little bit in this talk as well. So Ben got there before me, but here's the maps of the records in the BIS area, and as you can see on the left, the older records are included in this one, and they're a bit more scattered, a bit more widespread, and they've definitely sort of concentrated down into the southwest corner in the last few years. And unfortunately, the general, while as Ben said, they've had a good few years recently because of some good summer weather, the general trend is still decline, unfortunately. So the habitat they live in, as the name suggests, in this area, it tends to be marshy grassland. So Ross pasture is the classic Marsh Fritillary habitat, which is present in South and West Wales and some of Devon. And it's basically the name for species-rich marshy grassland, which has abundant devil's bit scabious, which is this purple plant here, which is the food plant of the Marsh Fritillary caterpillars. So yeah, in Wales, it's mainly where they're found, and it occurs on poorly drained, mainly acidic soils in lowland areas. So it goes right from the valley bottoms up to the fringe of the uplands that receives lots of rainfall. So quite, yeah, not an issue in Wales, that's for sure. So just some other pictures of typical Ross pasture. So it can be quite extensive. It's very difficult to get good pictures, I find, of Ross pasture, which show the structure of it and the diversity of it. It can look a little bit like uninteresting wasteland from photos, but once you get into good quality habitat, Ross pasture, then you'll really appreciate how good it can be. So another habitat in Wales that they use is in the national vegetation classifications, it's M24, which is a fen meadow habitat, which is a mixture of the purple moorgrass, Melinia, which is a big feature of the Ross pasture as well, and the meadow thistle, which is the inset picture there, and you can see them scattered about in the picture at the back there. And Carmarthenshire is a particularly good area for this habitat, and indeed Marsh Fritillaries. So a couple of pictures of a few other habitats that you can find Marsh Fritillaries in, and all of these rely on a certain, a good amount of devil's bit scabious. So this is a more heathy habitat, still with Melinia. This is almost unrecognizable as a good Marsh Fritillary habitat, but this is post-burn wet heathy habitat with the Melinia purple moorgrass tussocks just recovering at the moment. And this is a habitat that I don't think I've actually come across, but shorter grazed acid or neutral grassland, and the pink flower there is louthwort, which is a feature of that habitat. And June slacks as well. If they're like this one, which have a lot of scabious in it, then they can potentially host Marsh Fritillaries as well. So one habitat in which they've actually increased in recent years is dry calcareous grassland. This is in Gloucestershire, a place called Strawberry Banks Nature Reserve. Used to be a Wildlife Trust nature reserve there. I went there earlier in the year, and it was very strange for me coming from this area, seeing Marsh Fritillaries flying around in this sort of habitat. It was really quite odd. And the reason I think that they've increased in places like this is that the tight sward that was maintained by sheep and rabbits now gets less grazing and is starting to become a little bit more overgrown. So the structure is more suitable for Marsh Fritillaries. And one of the key areas is Salisbury Plain, which is host to this sort of habitat on a large scale. So Devil's bit scabious is the only food plant realistically that the caterpillars feed on, but it doesn't flower at the same time as the butterflies are flying. It flowers later, so it's in flower about now. So as well as scabious in the habitat, they need a good amount of nectaring nectaring species, so a good species-rich marshy grassland. So the photos here have got some examples of the flowers that they'll use to nectar on. These are all in hills. And along with this, there's sawwort, marsh bedstraw, meadow thistle, world caraway, ragged robin, all typical marshy grassland flowering plants. Right, so they live in a metapopulation structure. I don't particularly like these slides, but it's attempting to illustrate what a metapopulation is. It's basically a collection of small subpopulations in a landscape, which are interlinked, but not necessarily, they don't necessarily have good habitat in between. But they're all, they can all link up. So butterflies in theory can fly between one and the other. Any one of these small subpopulations is vulnerable to extinction at any time, and that is part of a functioning metapopulation. But the idea is that the network of populations is strong enough that if you lose a small population in 1 year, then in a good year, it can be recolonized by butterflies from some of the other surviving populations. So the small patches are vulnerable to just weather events, poor management, particularly bad breeding success for 1 year for whatever reason. But as long as the habitat is not completely destroyed, then it should be in a functioning metapopulation, should be able to be recolonized in the future. So marsh fritillaries can have quite dramatic boom and bust years because of this metapopulation structure. So new are potentially occupied in a good year when you get more scattered butterflies flying further and potentially finding good habitat. They are, as I said, pretty rubbish flyers. Generally, they struggle to get over, even if there's a fairly sizable hedge in between two pieces of good habitat, then that sometimes is enough for them to just sort of pack it in and like, oh, we're not going to get that far. Which is one reason why they're threatened, it has to be said. But these boom years, when they do happen, can be very dramatic. There's descriptions in the 19th century, which is hard to believe now, but where Irish villagers had to rake up and burn piles of caterpillars that they were so notorious, so numerous, sorry, because once they've eaten their devils in an area, they won't transfer to any other plant, so they have to then go marching off to find the nearest devil's bit scabious, which can often be a fair way away. So yeah, I've got a description of one event where it said they were so multitudinous in some fields that a black layer of insects seemed to roll in corrugations as the migrating hosts swarmed over one another in search of food, which sounds a bit like a sci-fi film, but apparently is true. This was in Ireland. But they were now across the country. They were always in scattered, quite localized populations, and individual colonies do tend to be quite small. You can get sort of large ones in if the habitat is large and good enough, but they do generally tend to live in small colonies. And one of the reasons that individual colonies can go extinct is a parasitic wasp, which I briefly mentioned earlier, and it's only going to be a brief mention now, and I'll be talking about that later on, but that is a very important factor. So this just sort of illustrates basically how if the populations, small subpopulations can become more isolated, then it leads to the whole metapopulation collapsing. So that you see the two little islands on the left there are completely isolated. So if some something happens to the one, then potentially that won't get recolonized. And similarly, to the right there, it's the loss of the population in the middle means that they would have to travel a lot further to find areas of suitable habitat. So I'll go through the flight period and life cycle now. So as with most Lepidoptera, the actual adult stage is very brief. So most Lepidoptera really should be considered caterpillars, and then occasionally they have this pretty flying stage which moves around and breeds. But the adults typically are only on the wing for 2 to 3 weeks, maybe a little bit more if the conditions are good. Basically just long enough to mate and lay eggs. But the majority of the year is larvages, which, as you can see, we're in August. So that, as Ben said, is the stage that we'll be, well, hopefully seeing next Wednesday, all being well. So where I should say the life cycle, May to June is the general flight period. It is slightly delayed if the weather's poor, and as you go further north, as with many species, the flight period is slightly later. So starting with this is a pair of mating Marsh Fritillaries. I think it's the male on the bottom, but I'm not 100% sure, I'll be honest. The males tend to emerge first, as with many species, and tend to be also the most visible as they fly about the habitat, patrolling, waiting for females to emerge. And when they do emerge, they tend to get mated very quickly, often before they've even fully emerged. From the pupa, they can be mated, and charmingly, the males then block their genital opening with a sort of chastity belt of foam, which means they can't then with any other males, whereas the male, of course, is free to go and mate with other females. So once mated, the female then flies around looking for some devil's bit scabious plants, which obviously won't be flowering like this at the time. They usually lay their eggs on large leaves of scabious. In Europe, they will use honeysuckle, and in some calcareous grassland areas, they'll use small or field scabious, but generally it's devil's bit scabious or nothing. As I said, they'll starve rather than attempt to eat anything else. So another reason why they're probably threatened. They don't help themselves in lots of ways, to be honest. So the females typically lay eggs on the underside of the leaf, and usually in multiple layers. It tends to be, as I said, on the day of emergence, so more or less as soon as they've mated. And that's initially around 300 eggs over several hours, and then on subsequent days they'll lay smaller batches, and that she can be absolutely packed full of eggs. So once she's laid her first batch, her body's sort of like an empty sack, basically. Poor thing. But this is a video I took of one laying eggs earlier this year. Hopefully it'll work for you. So, as you can imagine, if she's laying 300 eggs, that's a long old process. So multiple females can lay eggs on the same leaf, which is probably because it's in an optimum position and conditional climate, but also the caterpillars benefit from large aggregations as protection from predation, because the caterpillars, particularly when they're a bit more mature, are black and spiky, and when they're all together, it's a bit more of a deterrent to predators than if they're just wandering around on their own and vulnerable. Particularly when they're in their early stages, they're really very, very tiny and very vulnerable. So you can see the picture on the left-hand side there, how they're laid in layers, one on top of the other. And they take about 30 days to hatch, which, as with most of the life stages, depend on the weather and the nature of the site as well. So even within a good site, the areas of really suitable Marsh Fritillary habitat can be actually quite small, and depends on aspect and temperature, surrounding scrub, that sort of thing. So as you saw in the video, they're a lovely yellow colour when they're first laid, and then they gradually turn brown. I think unfertilized ones stay yellow, but the majority of them turn brown. And you can see just how numerous the eggs are in these batches here. And then once they're ready to hatch, they turn this lovely purpley violet colour, which is just really beautiful, beautiful things. And then once they're just about to hatch, they turn a greyish colour, and you can see the caterpillar's heads through the shell at this point, which you can see in this picture. So the majority of these eggs, as you can see, have hatched. But you can just about see some of the ones which are greyish looking, and those you can see that their heads are just sort of poking through there. And these obviously are very newly hatched, and their first meal is their egg. Then they don't waste anything. So as with many species, they have a sort of typical R strategy, it's known as. So they lay a lot of eggs, and there's lots of losses, basically. That's their strategy. So no parental care or anything. They're just laid and left to it. But they begin their life by creating this communal web, which you can just about see the sort of the silk starting to develop between them. These caterpillars are just over 1 millimeter long at this stage, so almost barely visible, unless you're really looking for them, which is obviously what we were doing. And the web that they create obviously provides some protection for them, as well as humid conditions which are thought to prevent the leaves that they're feeding on from drying out. And creating webs is something that they do throughout their life stage. So this is just a brief video of the larvae wriggling around in their web very early on, and you can see how much frass, which is caterpillar poo, builds up in there. So they frequently have to move and create new webs. And you can see the little holes in the web where they retreat into when threatened, and then come out of to bask potentially if it's warm and sunny. You can see just how dense these little populations are. And this is just one small batch of eggs that's that population has come from. So early on, so these little caterpillars are on the underside of the leaf, so very difficult to find. The first time they become fairly easily spottable is when the feeding signs start to develop on the upper surface of the scabious leaves. So the caterpillars, when they're this size, just feed on the lower epidermis of the leaf, the sort of windows through which go this brown color, but you can see when it's fresh and when the light's behind it, you can see the caterpillars sort of silhouetted in that. So instars is just a fancy name basically for the different stages of a caterpillar's development, which is pretty amazing. I know it's familiar to most people, but it doesn't make it any less incredible. So they stay as the tiny first instar for about 2 to 3 weeks, again, depending on weather, before they molt to the second instar, which is this one. And as they molt, they create another large communal web, and this is around parts of the scabious plant. It's not just underneath the leaves like the previous instar was. And again, it's got the tunnels running from the surface down into the protected interior. So caterpillars, in all Lepidoptera, the caterpillar itself already contains sort of the blueprint for the butterfly it's going to become. It's an absolutely amazing change. So the blue cells are known as imaginal discs, which are dormant clusters of cells, which basically there's ones for each structure in the body. The main ones, the legs, antennae, genitalia and wings. And a hormone, which is known as the Nile hormone, which stops basically the caterpillar developing into an adult, stops the cells replicating, which keeps a caterpillar for as long as it needs to. And then once it outgrows its skin and is ready to change to the next instar, there's a hormone which triggers it to molt, basically. So firstly, the head capsule, which you can see as the black blob in these second instar caterpillars, this head capsule just pops off with the caterpillar wriggling out of its old skin and then expanding. And it pulls. So caterpillars of butterflies have the 6 jointed legs at the front, which is characteristic of insects, and then they have sort of fleshy prolegs, they're known as, at the back. So it basically claws its way out with the true legs at the front, which is when they're most vulnerable because they're not feeding, their skin hasn't hardened yet. So they basically stay around where they've emerged and feed on their skin that they've just shed, which is pretty unpleasant, but it makes perfect sense. And then it moves on to its next stage. So this is another photo of the second instar caterpillars. They can be more obviously seen than the first instar ones, and they will wander around the web, the top of the web like this. And then generally at night you can see sort of them packed into the middle, and then they come out when the sun's on the leaves. So third instar caterpillars, this is only well, another 2 to 3 weeks afterwards. They vary a little bit between webs depending on the conditions that they've grown up in, but they tend to be darker. And the development times, see, this is quite late that third instar larvae is seen. We've got third instar larvae and have had for at least a couple of weeks in the breeding program that I'm going to talk about later. And also, obviously, eggs are laid at different times through the flight period, which is obviously going to affect the development of the caterpillars. So these third instar caterpillars spin even a much denser web, which is usually concealed underneath vegetation, and therefore protected from some of the worst weather that starts to develop as the summer turns into autumn. So this picture shows a second and a third instar caterpillar. The third one is the one on the left with the 2, you can just about see the 2 sort of anal spines at the back end there, which are slightly more prominent than the other spikes in the second instar one. They're a bit more uniform throughout the body. So within this web, they turn into the fourth instar. This photo, as you can see, was taken by Rob, who anybody who's going on the field trip next week will meet, and hopefully this is the sort of thing that you'll be seeing. It's the fourth instar caterpillars basking in the sun on the top of their larval web. So within this larval web, they then hibernate over the winter. So they spend another 2 weeks as that third instar, and then they're ready for hibernation, basically. So they don't feed as this fourth instar at this stage, and their web is an incredible structure. So as they're going to be in it over winter, it obviously has to offer quite a lot of protection. As in their marshy grassland habitat, obviously it can get pretty wet and wild, and while they're in this larval web at this stage, they can actually cope with being submerged in water for days at a time. It's that waterproof, which is obviously pretty essential in some of the Ross pasture habitat that they're in this sort of area. So once they've hibernated, they tend to emerge February time. It does depend somewhat on the weather, and then they don't they don't eat for the first week or so until they're up to speed. So they spend that time basking generally, communally like this, so for protection and also temperature regulation. If they're all gathered together, obviously the temperature is going to get higher more quickly, which then aids their development, and they can be really visible at this stage. It's a good time to go and spot them. Excuse me. So once the caterpillars molt again into their fifth instar, which you can see they're a bit more speckly, they're obviously a bit larger, about just over 10 millimeters long, just over a centimeter long. This is late March, early April time generally that they turn into the fifth instar, and these bask in slightly small groups, and you'll see them becoming more solitary than previous stages. So you can see this one is out on its own. You'll see them wandering a bit more widely in search of food than they have done before. After another couple of weeks, they molt into their sixth and final instar. So this is a fully mature Marsh Fritillary caterpillar with characteristic white speckling along the sides, and orange legs at the back. So they're the fleshy pro legs, and you can see the 6 true legs there at the front. It also very charmingly did a massive poo as I was taking a photo of it. So at this stage they become much more independent. They feed on their own, and they range a bit more widely. They sometimes at this stage will eat honeysuckle in hedgerows, as the scabious starts to get a bit eaten. They feed on honeysuckle much more commonly in Europe, for whatever reason. It might be that honeysuckle in the UK tends to grow in shadier areas. I'm not entirely sure. So once it's stuffed face to the stage where it's about 25 to 30 millimeters long, then it becomes ready to pupate. So it finds a site low down in vegetation, and creates a little silk pad, and hangs itself upside down by its pro legs, and sort of holds itself in a hooked sort of J shape, and then it starts to pupate. So this is kind of late April to mid-May. So this caterpillar here isn't far off pupating. And the pupa for Marsh Fritillaries or pupae are absolutely beautiful. Certainly one of the most beautiful pupae that I've seen. They're this beautiful mix of white, yellow, and black, really striking. So butterflies, as with many insects, are holometabolists, which means they metamorphosize completely between their life stages. So in the pupa, the caterpillar is basically melted down to undifferentiated cells, which then the individual cells can turn into any kind of cell. So just before the caterpillar pupates, it looks perfectly normal, but there's enzymes in its gut which basically trigger a self-destruct, more or less. Tissues are dissolved down, and it just keeps those imaginal discs that I mentioned and integral parts of the brain as well, which are known as mushroom bodies, which are responsible for olfaction and memory. So experiments have shown that butterflies can remember what caterpillars, the late stage caterpillars, have experienced. So you can condition caterpillars to react to, so with electric shocks, to certain smells, for example. So it causes a reaction when they smell it, and that it's been shown that that can transfer through, so they react the same as adults, which is pretty amazing as far as I'm concerned. So then the skin behind the caterpillar's head, so this is a pupa, remember, is upside down inside there. So the skin behind the caterpillar's head splits open and the pupa emerges from it, and then it sort of wriggles the caterpillar skin out of the way until there's just the last pair of prolegs clinging on to that. So you can see the silk pad at the top there. And then it releases its prolegs and stabs. It's a sort of stem-like structure, which is called a cremaster. And just to warn you, don't search cremaster on Google Images when you're at work, because there's a human structure which apparently is quite different to the butterfly one. So they're sort of hooked and they hang themselves on this silk pad. And the pupae are just incredible. You can't see it on this one. I think you can on one of the slides coming up. You can see where the antennae are. So the one on the right there, you can see the eyes down the bottom. You can see the antennae folded up along the front of the body and the wings on the side there. So the one on the left is a little bit messy, but you can see the silk pad at the top. And the one on the right, the thing to the right of it is where a previous pupa was. But you can see how it turns sort of a dark purplish colour just before it's ready to emerge, which again, depending on weather conditions, is about 3 weeks after it's initially pupated, before it ecloses, which is the fancy name for emerging. So hopefully I managed to get a video of one emerging earlier this year, which I'm hoping is going to work. It's a little bit longer than the other videos, so bear with it. So absolutely, I was so happy to have recorded that. I'd been sat watching this pupa. I noticed it had gone sort of purplish. So I sat watching it for at least a couple of hours with my camera, and then I had to pop away for maybe 10 minutes. So I sort of toyed with the idea, do I leave my camera just filming it? Or is it going to be safe here? Oh, may as well, you know, I'd be kicking myself if anything happened. And I came back and yeah, the butterfly was sat there in the middle of this stage, basically. So yeah, I was really chuffed, disappointed not to have seen it in the flesh, but really, really chuffed to have got it on camera. So as you could see from that, the video, when it emerges, initially the wings are all crumpled up, and then the fluid, sort of blood-like fluid, meconium, is then pumped through the veins of the wings to expand them, at which point they dry and harden, and meconium then is drawn back into the body. This whole process, depending on the weather, if it's a nice sunny day, takes about half an hour, and then they're ready to fly, which, yeah, is a fantastic sight. So, as with the majority of insects, they have numerous ways of dying. They're predated on in all stages by numerous creatures. This is a lovely photo that someone took of a type of shield bug impaling a Marsh Fritillary caterpillar. And then the one on the right is one I took of an orb weaver, which had just caught Marsh Fritillary. And these orb weavers, I think, would probably be a prime source of death for Marsh Fritillaries, because if anyone's walked through Marsh Fritillary habitat at that sort of time of year, you'll find your legs get covered by their webs, and sometimes spiders themselves, and they get pretty chunky. So I like spiders, but I've almost crashed my car when I suddenly realized there was one crawling up my chest that I'd clearly picked up during Marsh Fritillary surveys. But one of the most important predators, or not predators, but causes of death for Marsh Fritillaries, is this tiny little parasitic wasp, which has a bit of a ridiculous name, frankly, but Cotesia bignelli, which doesn't have a common name, but it's one of two Cotesia species of parasitic wasp, and the other one being Melitarium, or Melitiarum, however you want to pronounce it, but tiny little parasitoids. So parasitoids are parasites that kill their host. So the Cotesia bignelli, which is the one we're interested in, its only host is Marsh Fritillaries. So as you can imagine, it's even rarer than the butterfly itself is. There's another Cotesia, as I said, and that one also parasitizes Glanville fritillaries, which are really rare. They're only on the south coast of the Isle of Wight. It's pretty horrific. Parasites are just amazing if you don't have to host one. So the wasps lay their eggs directly into the caterpillars, which hatch and stew away on the inside of the caterpillars, eating everything except the bare minimum the caterpillar needs to survive on. So they keep it alive as long as possible, and then once it's ready, it breaks through the skin, forms this little cocoon, which you can see in the middle there, and then the adult wasp emerges. And horrifically, the caterpillars can be host as much as 70 of these wasp grubs, which is, yeah, just makes me feel slightly uncomfortable, I have to say. But they are very important in population biology of Marsh Fritillaries, which I'll go into in a minute. But first of all, I think I've got another video of the wasp just wandering around a emerged from. So that was taken through a microscope to give you some idea of scale. I've got a photo later on with it next to a hand, but really, really tiny. And each generation of caterpillars, one of the reasons they have such an impact on Marsh Fritillary populations is that for each generation of butterfly, the wasp itself can have 3 generations. So So it's not a particularly clear, I don't think, table there. But I'll try and walk through it. So newly hatched caterpillars in July, so the first instar, they're kept alive until August, when the wasp emerges. So then the second generation of wasps parasitizes the fourth instar caterpillars. So just before hibernation, they're parasitized again. And this wasp grub then spends the winter inside the caterpillar, which is hibernating, keeps the caterpillar alive for all this time, and then emerges in spring from the fourth instar caterpillar. And it will then parasitize the fifth instar caterpillars just before they pupate. So they have an issue at this stage, in that when they emerge, they wouldn't have any caterpillars to pupate, to parasitize. And at this stage, they can't parasitize eggs or pupae or the adults, so they have to parasitize the larvae. So at this stage, they have two methods of doing this. So they keep the final instar caterpillar alive for much longer than they would naturally. So if the caterpillars have pupated and there are still a few knocking around, then they're likely to be ones that have been parasitized. And then once the wasps kill the caterpillar and emerge, they stay in their little cocoons. Instead of coming out really quickly, they stay in that cocoon for a few weeks, so that by the time they do emerge, the first generation of caterpillars has hatched and are ready for parasitizing. I hope that's made it clear. I feel like I've been a little bit garbly there, I'm afraid. But basically, three generations in one generation of caterpillars is a pretty major potential impact on the Marsh Fritillary. But they're an essential part of this, and they contribute to the boom and bust sort of lifestyle, in that once a Marsh Fritillary population gets big enough to host a good population of the wasps, that wasp population will expand, potentially sort of explosively almost, which can then restrict that Marsh Fritillary population. And if it's a small enough colony, then it can potentially cause a local extinction in that area. And if that happens, then obviously the wasps from that colony have also gone extinct. But then in a good year for the Marsh Fritillary, that habitat is still there. So in theory, that can be recolonized, which will be a population of uninfected butterflies at that stage, which can then recover before inevitably the wasps return and the whole cycle begins again. And amazingly, even though these wasps are really, really tiny, they themselves are parasitized by another wasp, which is, yeah, I can't imagine how small that one is. So the presence of the wasp actually, paradoxically, can mean that there's quite a good resilient Marsh Fritillary population, because if it's big enough to support the wasps, then that's a good thing. And as I said, the wasp itself is rarer than the actual butterfly, so it does need to take it into shore. Right, so I'm going to talk about Marsh Fritillary habitat and management now, which I think Rob will go into on the Wednesday anyway, for those who are going, but I'll go through it here anyway. So the management of the Marsh Fritillary habitat benefits a huge number of other species, plants, invertebrates, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, all sorts. So not only do you want lots of double-bit scabious like this, which is a good late summer nectar source, really important late summer nectar source for a range of butterflies, bees, hoverflies, all sorts. including the rare scabious mining bee, which Liam kindly sent me a photo of. And also the habitat supports other rare species, like forester moths is one that's sort of characteristic of it, as are, I think, now bordered bee hawk moths, which are another devil's bit scabious feeder. So here's just gratuitous pictures of some other species that you can get in the Ross pasture habitat. So the tussocky malinia and Juncus, soft rush kind of areas, are good for harvest mice, which is on the left, and also good for grass snakes and adders, and you tend to find lizards all over this sort of habitat as well. And the marshy areas are good for a range of damselflies and dragonflies, banded demoiselle in this particular case. So management wise, basically grazing is the ideal management for Marsh Fritillary habitat. It's not straightforward. The aim is to have that uneven sward, which, as I said, is really quite difficult to get photos of that show it clearly. So you really need to see it in the field to get an idea of what you're looking for. So it's, broadly speaking, sort of 10 to 25 centimeters tall vegetation, a mix throughout. So ideally light, extensive grazing by cattle. Cattle are the best thing because they don't graze it tight down like horses can and like sheep certainly do. And they also, unlike sheep, don't preferentially go for the scabious leaves. So the ideal time is spring and summer when the grasses are growing. And not only does it keep the sward at the right sort of level, it removes the dead grass and leaf litter that will build up otherwise. And you can see on the right hand picture there, which is very undergrazed Marsh Fritillary habitat or Ross pasture, all that sort of rank grass, which prevents the wildflowers then setting seed and germinating, because you just don't get the light going down to the soil. And the left picture is a good photo of habitat that could potentially be good for Marsh Fritillaries if the grazing pressure was decreased slightly. So basically the correct levels of grazing will allow the scabious and other nectar plants to flourish while still offering protection from weather, etc., and places to hibernate. So cattle like Welsh Blacks, Highlands, Belted Galloways, that sort of thing are most suited to grazing Marsh Fritillary habitat. They're a bit more choosy. They'll also eat the young willows and things which come in and would gradually take over the grassland habitat. The dung is obviously good for invertebrates, and where they lightly poach can open up areas for wildflowers to colonize as well. Obviously, if the poaching gets too heavy, then you move them off, but it's a constant sort of monitoring of stocking levels. And sometimes you need to sort of convince the cows to go into areas where they might not necessarily choose to initially. So you can use, if there's a certain area of a piece of land that needs a bit more grazing pressure, then you can use salt licks or the no fence grazing collars to encourage them into certain areas, which will then gradually prevent overgrazing of other parts of the site, and hopefully bring that part of the site into good condition. Yeah, as it says, basically avoid sheep. They just graze it far too tightly, as you can see in that picture. So it may be an iconic Welsh habitat, but no sheep. So burning is another potential management tool which is used very occasionally. It's certainly not the recommended one generally. Grazing is always the go-to if possible. But burning can be effective in some areas. It leads to a sort of fresh flush of growth, which can then encourage livestock into an area, but there's certain restrictions basically on where and when you should do it. So cool, quick burns are the ideal thing, so it's not too destructive. If you're doing it on a site where Marsh Fritillary are already, then ideally search for them in early September and avoid the areas where they are if possible. Usually you'll be needing to cut fire breaks to prevent it getting completely out of control. And obviously it's only legal at certain times of year to be doing it, but it's a very small minority of sites where this is realistically going to be carried out. It's really predominantly about getting the grazing levels right. Sometimes before you get to the stage where you need to get the grazing, you need to do a bit of scrub control. So if a site has been unmanaged for long enough, then you rapidly get the brambles coming in, the young willow, the young alder, the young birch starting to come in, and succession will eventually occur, which, while good for lots of species, the flower-rich marshy grassland habitat is a much rarer habitat than scrub or woodland. So that's why the management of these sites is so important. They're becoming increasingly rare. So we've done, as a wildlife trust, we've done a fair bit of management of our own reserves to ensure that they're improving for Marsh Fritillaries, which does involve cutting trees down, which is a bit of a controversial issue, but it's unfortunately the only way of maintaining these habitats and ensuring they don't just completely disappear. So usually it's this sort of a bit of scrub clearance, a bit of tree clearance to allow the Molinia and associated plants to spread back into where they were. And then you've got that happening, you put the grazing in, and the cattle then will constantly be keeping that scrub back by themselves. And another option, mowing is again, it's not ideal because you don't get that mix of sward heights, and also where there's like anthills, that sort of thing, then it can be quite damaging of other habitats. But sometimes if you go in there with brush cutters, you can clear away the thatch and the dead Molinia from specific areas, which will then bounce back. So you do that in sort of a mosaic pattern, and then you'd get the cattle in when there's enough fresh growth for them to be fed. Right. On the subject of habitat management, I should say, sorry, that Inc. has produced a Marsh Fritillary habitat guidelines of booklet, which is on our website, which I'll pop up at the end of the talk, or I can email it to you directly if you'd prefer that. If you put a note in the chat if you'd like that to be the case, and we can get that sorted to you. It goes through all basically what I've said in a bit more detail. So monitoring, which is sort of what the visit next week is going to involve. So this is just going to be a very brief mention of monitoring techniques. So the best method for Marsh Fritillary monitoring is the larval web counts, which go on at this sort of time. So from now, slightly earlier in August to early October, depending on season, weather, whereabouts you are in the country, that sort of thing. So the surveys go on before they enter hibernation, obviously when the caterpillars are much more visible, and also not in or after heavy rain, because the webs will disintegrate if they're in that condition before they're, if they're not tucked under the vegetation completely ready for hibernation. So on the butterfly conservation website, they've got information about standard monitoring methodologies, and also surveys that they carry out. There's a specific method for that, which you can find out about, and you can download the forms and things from the butterfly conservation website. You don't tend to monitor the adults very often, because it's a very unreliable and difficult survey. It doesn't necessarily give you any useful information, because they're flying about so much that it's very difficult to get accurate counts. This is just a photo in case you don't know what people looking for stuff looks like. They're undertaking a larval web survey. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about INC's project, which is a population reinforcement. And there's a sort of forerunner to this project, which was up in Cumbria. So in 2004, the population of marsh fritillaries in Cumbria was 155 caterpillars across 2 webs. So something needed to be done, basically. So there was a coordinated group up there who took on this role and got licenses to do a reintroduction project. So it used stock from Scotland, and some of the ones in Cumbria were taken into captivity and they were bred up, so maximize the genetic diversity. And then the first reintroductions went ahead in 2007. So by 2011, so that's what, 7 years after the population was down to 155 caterpillars. By 2011, they were on 8 sites with at least 1,000 webs going into hibernation. So that is a huge increase and a real success. So INC's plan was, before Wales gets to the stage of having sort of such a low population, and it seems unlikely, but the populations are decreasing still. So before we get to that stage, we thought we would try and get a project going similar to the one up in Cumbria to help bolster the populations in Wales, so to give them a bit of a helping hand, basically. So the area we chose was in the Ely, so around the towns of Llantrisant and Tonrefile. And this was one of INC's main projects when they were set up. It's one of Rob's, real main aims. And this area sort of had a population of marsh fritillaries that was important on a UK scale, but despite that, it has been decreasing for 25 years at least. And a key area potentially is Llantrisant Common, which is 113 hectares of potential marsh fritillary habitat in a landscape with other potential marsh fritillary habitat scattered around it. So this is the distribution of marsh fritillary in the early 90s. As you can see, the Llantrisant Common is the red blob down there, and all the red dots, marsh fritillary records. So move ahead to 2011 to 15, we're down to this. So a real remnant population in this area. So it was a combination of, certainly on Llantrisant Common, of historic, intensive grazing and under-management of some areas, over-management of others on the common. And those factors basically led to the extinction of the local marsh fritillary populations. And the nearby colonies are too far away for them to naturally find their way back to Llantrisant Common. So since the surveys, these initial surveys of the common were done, the habitat has been massively improved. So a restoration project is completely pointless if the habitat that you're trying to recolonize with something is still a bit rubbish, because you just right. So the key thing was to ensure that this large area of habitat was in good condition. So The common had been, as I said, either under or overgrazed, but a management agreement with the Llantrisant Town Trust was set up, along with Rhondda and Taff, and it's led to a vast improvement of the habitats there, not just for Marsh Fritillary. So this photo is, it was 2010, that, and then the one bottom right year, and you can see how the grazing levels have been improved, and it's had a massive positive impact. So surveys were done in 2011, habitat surveys of the common, by Richard Wistow, the county ecologist, who's here on the left. And last year, me and a couple of other volunteers, Ben, who is a local lepidopterist and knows the area and Marsh Fritillary incredibly well, went with Richard to get some instruction basically on exactly how to do the habitat surveys, so that a resurvey, which we did last year, could be directly comparable to the surveys that he carried out originally. This map takes a bit of reading, I'll be honest, but the basic take-home message is that the good habitat in red has massively increased in the 9 years since the first survey was done, and also the grey blocks, which are the not suitable habitat, have really significantly decreased. And there's good habitat there, which is either down as suitable undergrazed or suitable overgrazed, and those are areas that we'll be targeting with either targeted grazing or trying to keep cattle, and there's a lot of horses on the common as well, but keep them out of certain areas so that more and more of the common becomes red on these maps. So eventually, after lots of hard work, Rob managed to get a license for collection of 80 caterpillars from the wild in RCT, Rhondda and Taff, and then their subsequent release after captive breeding at the common. So strict limits on the number of caterpillars collected and how many each site, and also how many sites, so that there was limited impact. So in preparation for the collection, Rob started creating some pens at the National Botanic Garden, which has been our base, excuse me, and also growing up lots of scabious ready for them to feed on. So these are the pens that we had the scabious in, yeah, ready for the caterpillars to be plonked on when they were collected. 2021, March this year, sites that had been chosen, they were chosen on the grounds of their capacity to withstand the temporary depletion of the population there, without impacting the population as a whole, which 80 caterpillars is a very small proportion when taken from the 6 sites in total. And that was all done in consultation with NRW and county ecologists. So we didn't at this stage obviously know how successful we were going to be, but potentially it was going to lead to a massive number of caterpillars to release back onto the common. To give you an idea of how successful it can be, in Cumbria, they collected 250 caterpillars originally, and that, when it came to time of release, led to 50,000 larvae, which is fairly daunting and has proved to be quite daunting, to be honest. So this is the majority of my job recently, has been looking after these caterpillars. So they were collected as 4th instar, sorry, caterpillars. And back at the gardens, they developed into their 6th instar, and we had some, as you can see on the right, where the Cortesia bignelli has emerged. So any caterpillars that we saw the wasp emerging from, we put in isolation, because we didn't want the majority of our caterpillars to be parasitized, because we wanted a clean slate to start with, basically. So once we'd isolated the wasp, they were taken and released back where that caterpillar had come from. So we didn't impact the wasp populations either. So there's another picture of the wasp cocoons, and there's that wasp picture with a hand for scale. Yeah, just to give you an idea of how small they are. And at this stage, a lot of the project was done by a placement student at the Gardens, so Katie Ritchie, who was a huge help, and the project wouldn't realistically have been successful at all without her help on the ground there every day. So at every stage of this, we didn't know how successful it was going to be. It was quite stressful. It's all a new thing, and it was all a trial really, in more ways than one sometimes. So we don't have the date of the exact first pupation that we found, but you can see these have pupated on the sides of the pens that they were in. We had a slight setback at the start of May when a storm knocked over some of our pens, and we did definitely lose a few, but we think we managed it away quite lightly. So in these pens, we had lots and lots of butterflies emerging as the weeks went on. So we put a number of nectar sources in there with them. So we had chives, sage, and bugle mainly, and occasionally we had these sort of artificial little feeding stations, but that was very much a minimum. If for whatever reason we couldn't get a flowering plant in there at the appropriate time. So even though we had lots of butterflies flying around, and we did have lots of butterflies flying around, we weren't sure that they would mate. But I'm not saying it's linked, but the first day that I worked for Inc. was the day that we found mating for the first time, which was very exciting. So this was 17th of May. So that was another step closer to being able to release some animals. And then on my third day, we found our first batches of eggs, which, at each one of these significant stages is hugely exciting. So this is one of the leaves with 4 batches of eggs, probably multiple females. Yeah, just wonderful to see. So then we were daily basically going through all the scabious plants, trying to find colonies of eggs and tagging the leaves and doing approximate counts, which is one of the less rewarding jobs that Katie had, bless her, to try and give us some idea of how many we might end up with. And as I said, some of these aren't going to be fertilized, but it still gives you an eye. And then, yeah, gradually we just monitored them as they hatched and developed from first to second to third instars, as you've seen the photos earlier on. It involved a lot of volunteer help. So as the caterpillars have been getting through the scabious, we've had volunteers helping grow on the scabious and pot it on and ensure that they've got a constant source of food. So this is one of the pens with some webs starting to develop. You can just see on the bottom left there, a web developing in the tub on the scabious there. And we stuffed lots of hay around the tubs for them to sort of retreat into if necessary. And then we kept an eye and tried to keep account of how many larval webs we were getting. But that has become increasingly difficult as the weeks have gone on. And this was the sight in one of the pens yesterday. As you can see, there's very little scabious left in there. There is some hidden under the webs, which you can't quite see, but we're having to buy new pens on a fairly regular basis and move the caterpillars in between them to ensure that they don't starve before their release, which will be in a couple of weeks, basically, which is very exciting, on Llantrisant Common, which is, yeah, the result of basically years of Rob's hard work getting to this stage. And it's a multiple year project, so we'll be keeping some of the caterpillars over winter to breed up for future releases, yeah, to give the populations as much of a chance as possible. And then we'll be going back and monitoring the sites in the spring to see how many larval webs have survived the winter, and then subsequently hopefully find some flying adults. So yeah, that's it for me. If you want to find any more about Inc. or the project, then there's our website there, and please do follow us on Twitter and or Facebook, where there are regular updates about this project and some of the other work that Inc. are involved in.